Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 521. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. All right, we got quite a bit of news to get through on today's show, but I got a really big and really awesome announcement first. Myself and co-host of the show, Connor Freeman, were on Part of the Problem with Dave Smith. So huge thank you to Dave for having, the Libertarian Institute crew, Scott Horton, Connor Freeman, and myself on for an end of the year roundtable and to talk about all the great things the Institute has done this year, but also to let us talk about foreign policy on his show and to have access to his platform. So that I had a great time so far. All the feedback I've gotten from people is that the appearance went really well. People really liked what me and Connor had to say. So if you haven't listened already, make sure you add that to your queue. And if you like it, make sure you let Dave know in the comment section. Say like, hey, these guys are really great. You should have them back on, because I know both myself and Connor would like to be on that show again at some point in the future. So again, for anybody who's, coming over from Dave Smith's audience, saw us, heard about the show, and want to check out our product, I hope, you enjoyed today's episode. We are going to jump right into it. Just remember, if you are a new listener, you like the show, subscribe to it somewhere. You follow me on Twitter at Kyle _. The show is at @con_interest. All right, here we go. First up on today's show, Venezuela to have increased naval activity until UK warship leaves Guyana's waters. In a video posted to X, the Venezuelan defense minister said, armed forces have been deployed not just in the east of the country, but across the entire country. They will be there until this British imperialist boat leaves the disputed waters between Venezuela and Guyana. And offshore oil discoveries have reignited tensions between the South American neighbors over a disputed region in recent months. The leaders of Venezuela and Guyana agreed to settle the dispute without force or threats. However, the UK sent a warship to Guyana, outraging Venezuela. And I'm sure, a big part of the reason why this is so outrageous is that Venezuela feels that this entire territorial dispute is only due to the legacy of colonialism, and of course the UK sending a warship to a small South American country to help it flex its muscles is just a reminder of that kind of colonialism and imperialism. So I'm sure from the Venezuelan perspective, that was really rubbing it in their face. All right, so this here from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com, December 30th or 31st, Venezuela sends 6,000 troops to Guyana border, says they will stay there until the British ship leaves. And so, this is a second part of kind of what they're looking at doing in Venezuela in response to the HMS Trent, the British warship. Tensions over the fate of, it's about 2/3 of Guyana's country. It's the northern 2/3 that border Venezuela. And, this region, the reason it is disputed is because there's offshore oil in significant amounts. And my understanding is the reason the Venezuelans have reignited this debate isn't necessarily just because the Venezuelans want that oil, but because Guyana has really started to develop those oil assets and start to pump that oil. And so, at this point, Guyana is really starting to build infrastructure and lay claim to this territory, where there was this long-standing agreement between the two countries not to, start to build infrastructure there and start to take the oil. And so Venezuela feels that Guyana has left that agreement, and now they have to find some way to respond. About a month ago, the leaders of Venezuela and Guyana met under a UN and Brazilian negotiated round of talks and agreed to a I think several point proposal, but the main point was that the two countries would not threaten each other, not do anything to lead to threats or military action, and would try to resolve the dispute through diplomacy. And it seems that the Venezuelans have really interpreted the deployment of the HMS Trent, this British warship, as a real, either threat against that agreement or violation of it completely. So it seems that they're going to escalate and they're going to put 6,000 troops near the border and keep them there until the British ships leave. All right, a couple stories on Ukraine here. Senator says Ukraine should cede territory to end war. This is Senator J.D. Vance. And the quote, "What's in America's best interest is to accept Ukraine is going to have to cede some territory to the Russians, and we need to bring this to a close." The senator questioned passing a massive aid package for Ukraine. He said, "What we're saying to the president and really the entire world is you need to articulate what the ambition is. What is 61 billion going to accomplish that 100 billion hasn't?" And Vance's remarks come as the White House has completely depleted its funding for arming and even giving financial assistance to Ukraine, is calling on Congress to go ahead and pass that. And so a lot of the Republican opposition to passing more Ukraine aid is just centered around that they want the White House to make more concessions on the border and immigration issue. And, not going to get into that debate here, but at this point, it seems like the White House is pretty willing to make a whole lot of concessions on those issues in order to get the Republicans to go ahead and allow the Ukraine aid to go through. But it is kind of interesting. We had this statement from J.D. Vance, which, suggests for him that this is actually a little bit of a bigger issue, and it's not just about the border issue. He's really concerned about the war in Ukraine as is and is looking to bring it to a close. All right, so this is a story I wrote for antiwar.com over the weekend. Ukrainian attack on Russia kills at least 21, and Kiev says the attack was a response to a large Russian military barrage on the previous day that killed nearly 40, which of course seems to be a response to Ukraine using a cruise missile to blow up a Russian warship in Crimea. And so just over the past week, there's been a few rounds of escalation that I cover here in this article. So Ukraine conducted a major attack inside of Russian territory, leaving, at the time I wrote this article, it was 14 people dead, but we have an update attached to this article that the new death toll is 21, including 3 children and 111 injured. The war has escalated over the past week as Ukraine has conducted strikes inside Russia, and Moscow has ordered a missile and drone barrage against Kiev. Russian authorities report that the Belgorod region that borders Ukraine came under missile and rocket attack on Saturday. And initially it was 14 dead, over 100 injured, and again that has increased quite significantly now. The Kremlin reports that several of the Ukrainian projectiles were shot down. The Russian military slammed the attack as indiscriminate and claimed that several of the rockets were cluster munitions. Now, I when I posted that, I had several people kind of interact with me on Twitter and ask if these were American weapons, the American cluster bombs that we are sending to Ukraine. And at least from the Russian representative to the United Nations, he called for a Security Council meeting and then summoned the Czech representative to explain why Czech weapons were used in the attack. And so that he's not summoning the Americans and saying that it's American weapons and that they're Czech weapons would, I guess, to me mean they probably weren't the American cluster bombs. But maybe Russia will try to produce or be able to produce evidence later on to say that, there were American weapons used too, but no evidence of that at this point. And I don't think the Russians would really hold that back if it was the case. So the Ukrainian attack came after Russia conducted an attack on Kiev and other major Ukrainian cities with over 150 drones and missiles. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry says about 100 of the projectiles were intercepted by air defenses. Ukrainian officials report 39 killed across the country. The Russian missile barrage was likely a response to the Ukrainian attack on the Crimean Peninsula earlier in the week. A Russian landing ship was damaged by the Ukrainian cruise missile, and looked like pretty significantly as well. The Russian strike on Ukraine came just days or just before the UK announced a new weapons package for Ukraine. The UK Ministry of Defense explained in a statement that the package of around 200 air defense missiles will resupply the UK developed air defense systems provided to Ukraine in late 2022. These air defense missiles, advanced short range air to air missiles, are designed to be launched from aircraft, including UK's Typhoon and F 35 fighter jets. But the Ministry of Defense has upgraded or redesigned the interceptors to be fired from the ground. And I think one of the things that we see here in a couple recent stories, this and what I covered on the last show, that Japan had reworked their constitution and had agreed to send their Patriot interceptors to the U.S. to free up the U.S. to send Patriot interceptors to Ukraine. And so, along with 155 millimeter artillery shells, which are in very high demand in both the U.S. In Ukraine and Israel, I think Patriot interceptors are another weapon. Interceptors in general are another weapon that Western stockpiles are in very high need. If you look at the U.S. needs a lot of them in the Red Sea to deal with the Houthis. Israel needs Iron Dome interceptors to deal with Hamas, and also, I'm sure, other interceptors to deal with Hezbollah. They've even had to use their Arrow interceptors to intercept Houthi missiles. Ukraine needs a lot of them, and of course, the U.S. wants them all over the Asia Pacific for a potential war with China. And so, that we have the UK having to modify, air-to-air missiles, interceptors, to be fired from the ground, and Japan having to change up their constitution to do this logistical trick to ship missiles to the US to free up American stockpiles to ship to Ukraine is just I think really a sign that the Western stockpiles are getting very low, and there's a lot of concern here. All right, next up here, this is last story on Ukraine. Dave DeCamp, December 31st. Biden again warns the U.S. could fight Russia directly if Congress doesn't approve more Ukraine aid. President Biden on Friday again called for Congress to approve more spending on the war in Ukraine, claiming if Russian President Vladimir Putin is successful in this war, it could risk pulling the U.S. into a direct confrontation with Russia. Biden made the comments in a statement on Russian attack on Ukraine that was said to be the largest of the war. According to Ukrainian authorities, Russia fired over 150 missiles and drones across the country and killed 31 people. Now, that largest of the war claim was, I think, just from Kiev, and I have seen some other, like the New York Times, I believe, reported it as one of the largest since the beginning of the war. And so I'm not sure if it really was the largest of the war. Just wanted to clarify that. Biden said Ukraine was able to intercept some of the missiles with U.S. provided air defenses, and added that unless Congress takes urgent action in the new year, we will not be able to continue sending the weapons and vital air defense systems Ukraine needs to protect its people. The president claimed that the states of the war were beyond Ukraine to the U.S., European, NATO allies. When dictators and autocrats are allowed to run roughshod in Europe, the risk raises that the United States gets pulled in directly. And I really hate this because it's, just Biden saying, well, if you don't let me do this one really stupid thing I want to do, then I'm just going to do something really, really stupid and get in a direct war with Russia. There's no evidence that Russia plans to go beyond Ukraine or even go beyond eastern Ukraine, the territory, maybe beyond the territory that they've already taken. But I don't even think there's real evidence that they want to take the whole of the Ukrainian territory. I think that would probably present Moscow with more problems than solutions. All right, moving on to the Gaza war here. And I am sorry, but this is all really dark and awful news today. Over 1,000 children in Gaza have had one or both legs amputated since October 7th. So international aid workers visiting the Gaza Strip are relaying horrific situation Israel's inflicting on the Palestinians. UNICEF reports over 1,000 children have lost legs. Israel is forcing the 2.3 million residents of Gaza into increasingly small areas that lack the ability to accommodate basic needs for survival. UNICEF's spokesperson James Elder said around 1,000 children in Gaza have lost one or both of their legs. He told journalists in Geneva that every single child enduring the 10 weeks of hell, and not one of them can escape. And so I want to get into that number just a little bit, because when I posted this story, there was actually quite a bit of criticism from people saying, "Nuh-uh, the number is 9,000." And so the 9,000 number, from the best I could tell, it came from a Twitter account that didn't look closely enough at the UNICEF statement, where they said 9,000 children in Gaza had been injured and some of them had amputations. Now, this 1,000 here, this number that Elder gives, his statement says one or both legs. I'm not sure why he classified it this way. Like, they're not, he didn't report amputations. Maybe it's because if somebody loses a leg, then, mobility wise, they're far more limited. Not that losing an arm isn't an extremely significant injury, but wheelchair, crutches, ambulance to move these people, if you lose a leg. And so my guess is maybe that's why he was able to report this number the way he did. I have no idea what the total number of amputations is. Another thing that, I think is being incorrectly reported, kind of from the pro-Palestinian angle. And I think it's just very important that we get these numbers right. It's not that I'm trying to say, oh, this is less horrific. I don't think having 5,000 or 500 children or 1,000 children have to get amputated without anesthesia is, that much worse than the other. It's horrific, right? It's just horrific that this is happening hundreds, if not 1,000 times. But from what I could tell, when they're talking about doing amputations without anesthesia, they say there's been 1,000 amputations and some of them have been done without anesthesia. I don't think they've counted that or will be able to. We just know it's happening quite a bit. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Due to conditions in Gaza, as well as the lack of aid, doctors are often forced to conduct surgeries in unsanitary facilities without painkillers. Elder said not only were they amputated without anesthesia, but many of them were amputated in a very quick fashion. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, a London-based surgeon who traveled to Gaza to treat patients, told Middle East Eye that having to perform the operations without anesthesia was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do in my career. At a November press conference, he said, one night at the Al-Ali hospital, I performed amputations on 6 children. The UNICEF statement said that even if children recover from the amputation, they do not escape the hell and threat of death. Elder said, as a patient of a critically sick child told me, our situation is pure misery. I don't know if we will make it through this. Spokesperson for the WHO, Dr. Margaret Harris, added that WHO staff in Gaza spoke of not being able to walk in the emergency wards for, this is a quote, fear of stepping on people lying on the floor in severe pain and asking for food and water. She called the situation unconscionable and said that it's beyond belief that the world is allowing this to continue. The Israeli military has destroyed most hospitals in Gaza. The medical facilities continuing to operate face frequent attacks and a lack of supplies. The Washington Post investigation recently found that the Israeli Air Force is using 2,000-pound bombs near hospitals. Elder went on to say that the Israeli military operations made civilians face the constant threat of death. He explained, where do children and families go? They are not safe in hospitals. They are not safe in shelters. They are not safe in the so-called safe zones. The safe zones are tiny patches of barren land or street corners or half-built buildings with no water, no facilities, no shelter from the cold and the rain, and no sanitation. In recent weeks, experts have warned that forcing Palestinians into safe zones with no aid or infrastructure will will lead to famine and epidemics. Aid groups have already estimated that there are 100,000 cases of diarrhea, 150,000 respiratory infections, in addition to over 500,000 Palestinians in Gaza are already in a state of starvation. Elder warned the combination of malnutrition and disease will be lethal for the population. An immediate and long-lasting humanitarian ceasefire is the only way to end the killing and injuring of children, and the children deaths from the disease, and enable the urgent delivery of desperately needed life-saving aid, he explained. All right. Next up here this is from the Wall Street Journal, and it's just some figures that they had put together on the destruction of Gaza. So, quoting from the article here, nearly 70% of Gaza's 439,000 homes and about half of its buildings have already been damaged or destroyed. The bombing has damaged Byzantine churches and ancient mosques, factories and apartment buildings, shopping malls and luxury hotels, theaters and schools. Much of the electric, water, communications, and healthcare infrastructure that made Gaza function in the past are beyond repair. Most of the strip's 36 hospitals are shut down. Only 8 are accepting patients. Citrus trees, olive groves, and greenhouses have been obliterated. More than 2/3 of the schools are damaged. He Yin, an assistant professor of geography at Kent State University in Ohio, estimated that 20% of Gaza's agricultural land has been damaged or destroyed. The World Bank analysis concluded that by December 12th, the war had destroyed 77% of health facilities, 72% of municipal services such as parks, courts, and libraries, 68% of telecommunications infrastructure, 76% of commercial sites, including almost complete shutdown of the industrial zone in the north. More than half of all roads the World Bank found have been damaged or destroyed. Some 342 schools have been damaged, according to the UN, including 70 of its own. An assessment by the U.S. Office of Director of National Intelligence found that Israel dropped 29,000 weapons on Gaza in a little more than 2 months, according to U.S. officials. By comparison, the U.S. dropped 3,678 munitions on Iraq from 2004 to 2010, according to U.S. Central Command. And so, I mean, you look at these pictures from Gaza, and at first you could maybe tell yourself that, oh, this is just one neighborhood. This is, just one drone video of one street. But when you look at the satellite images that a lot of these mainstream outlets are putting out, I mean, it is just utter, like, erasure of the landscape. When Lindsey Graham talks about turning Gaza into a parking lot, I guess I really hope that he doesn't actually understand what that means. And it's like when Ted Cruz says we should turn Syria into glass. It's just not having an understanding. Like, it's not meant to be literal. Like, I don't think Ted Cruz actually was calling for nuclear weapons to be used in the Middle East. Maybe I'm wrong on that. And he really would go that far. But that's literally what Israel is doing. They are erasing Gaza, erasing the people that live there, the 2.3 million people that live there. And it's just one of the most disgusting things that I've ever witnessed. All right, next up here, this article is from the Sunday Times, and this one is horrific as well. All right, so quoting from the article here, more than 1 million have fled south to places such as Mawalsi, which stinks of rancid rubbish and toxic smoke, where there is still never enough food. Some children have scabies, diarrhea, and lice. A mother said she became separated from her husband along the way and does not know where he is. Around the encampment, people try to make fires with whatever they can find: bottles, crates, anything plastic that burns. The wood is long gone. There is no clean lavatories. Few have soap. Disease thrives. The air buzzes with the consistent sound of drones and warplanes. To live in Gaza today is to be constantly looking for food. No one has enough. Most markets are closed and food is sold as it becomes available. Some days you can find eggs, but no lentils, or salt, but not potatoes. Money can only get you so far. Prices are so absurd. A kilo of rice costs €8 when you can find it. Middle class people are going hungry. Banks are closed, and many have spent the cash they had with them at the beginning of the war. 85% of the population is displaced. Most of the people have nothing. A few have cans, beans, or some tuna. They given to them by aid organizations, but there is never enough food to go around, and people often just one or two cans per family every few days. Instead, they eat whatever they could find, even if the food is rotten, and it makes them vomit rancid eggs and moldy bread. This situation may be worse in northern Gaza, where barely any aid has reached the people in North Gaza, who are separated from the rest of the population by fighting. Phone signals are cut off in large swaths of Gaza City. Once bustling beachfronts and restaurants are destroyed. No one knows how many people remain in the north, but charities estimate it could be in the hundreds of thousands. They have nothing. On Friday, the UN said aid staff had been shot at by Israeli soldiers when trying to return from a rare trip there. The IDF did not respond for a request from comment. Aid agencies who have visited the area say starving civilians have taken to hunting down stray cats and dogs on the street for food. So yeah, I mean, I really don't have any commentary to add to that. It's really horrible. All right, next up, disease spreading in Gazan shelters. The head of the WHO posted on X, there are 180,000 upper respiratory infections, 136,000 cases of diarrhea, half of those among children aged under 5, where, that combined with malnutrition can be lethal. 55,000 cases of life and scabies, 4,500 cases of acute jaundice syndrome, and 126 cases of meningitis, as, of course, Israel has destroyed and decimated Gaza's healthcare system, and on purpose, too. One thing I could add to that Sunday Times article about people not having money and the banks have been closed. Well, Israel deliberately targeted Gaza's banks. They called them power targets. And, they did that to help lead to the crumbling and the absolute destruction of the society. All right, next up here. White House again uses emergency powers to ship weapons to Israel, bypassing Congress. A statement from the Pentagon said, the Secretary of State has approved a possible foreign military sale to the government of Israel of M107 155mm projectiles and related equipment for an estimated cost of $147.5 million. The Secretary of State has determined and provided detailed justification to Congress that an emergency exists that requires the immediate sale to the government of Israel of the above defense articles and services in the national security interest of the United States, thereby waiving congressional review requirements. Israel will use enhanced capability as a deterrent to regional threats and to strengthen its homeland defense. Israel has no difficulty absorbing this equipment into its armed forces. The proposed sale of this equipment will support and will not alter the basic military balance in the region. It is incumbent on all countries to employ munitions consistent with international humanitarian law, and the 155mm ammunition will be provided from U.S. Army stock. There is no offset agreement proposed in connection with this potential sale. And so this is, really disgusting for a few reasons. One, what the Biden administration needs to be doing is everything in its power to rein Israel in and to get them to stop this war, so aid could enter Gaza and we don't end up with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of death from very preventable diseases, malnutrition combined with cholera, anything that'll make you diarrheal and respiratory infection. And this is doing the exact opposite, right? I see videos all the time on Twitter of Palestinian cities and villages in Gaza being shelled by Israel, and then they run and try to help the people, and you see children that were just murdered by American weapons all the time happening in Israel. This needs to end. It's certainly not in the national security interests of the United States. That's certainly the most probably offensive part of that as an American, is that this directly undermines the safety and security of every American. It makes us targets because we are aiding in a genocide, right? That's what this policy is doing. And so by bypassing the congressional review so this could happen more covertly and without debate, it is putting every single American at more risk. It is not helping us whatsoever. This is just the worst policy that I've seen a American administration pursue in a long time. All right. Next up here, this one from DadeToCamp, December 31st. Israeli military says Gaza's slaughter will continue for all of 2024. The Israeli Defense Forces said Sunday that it would withdraw some of its troops from Gaza, but that it expects the brutal assault on the enclave to continue throughout the entirety of 2024, the Times of Israel reported. IDF spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagerly said that the military was adjusting its fighting methods to each area of Gaza to prepare for the conflict. Tonight, 2024 will begin. The goal of the war is to require lengthy fighting, and we are prepared accordingly. He said the IDF was taking measures out of an understanding that there will be needed additional measures and continue fighting for the duration of the coming year. He said some of the reservists will return to their families and work this week. The Times later reported that the IDF was pulling a total of 5 brigades out of Gaza. And so I do wonder how much this is really about potentially having to reorient and fight against Hezbollah, which Israel is continuing to escalate in that direction. And when it comes to an actual threat presented towards Israel, there's really not a comparison between what Hamas and what Hezbollah can do. The threat is much, much bigger from Hezbollah. And so maybe that's a part of this shift, but also there may be some real strain on the Israeli Defense Forces with their constant deployments and rotations and everything here after 3 months of fighting. And maybe this is a way to, give some soldiers some rest that maybe desperately need it. All right, next up here, Netanyahu gives some insight onto what Israel's plan is. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that his forces will conquer the territory along the Egyptian border with Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces started operations in northern Gaza, driving millions of Palestinians towards the border with Egypt. He said, "The southern stoppage point of Gaza must be in our hands. It must be shut. It is clear that any other arrangement would not ensure the demilitarization that we seek." And I believe that the Palestinian Authority and the Egyptians are currently, share control of that border. Netanyahu said the military will continue operations for several months. As the chief of staff said this week, this war will continue many more months. My policy is clear. We will continue to fight until we have achieved the objectives of this war. First and foremost, the annihilation of Hamas and the release of all hostages. The spokesperson for the IDF said the fighting force is making preparations for a year-long operation in Gaza. The Israeli operations in Gaza have already destroyed most of the infrastructure in the strip. Only 8 hospitals continue to function. 20% of the agricultural land has been destroyed. The Palestinians have been pushed into overcrowded areas, lacking basic needs for survival. And Tel Aviv is choking aid deliveries, adding to the starvation and disease that's already spreading. Now, if anybody's watching the show here on YouTube or Rumble or something like that, you see I got a map of Gaza up here, but if anybody just pulls up a map of Gaza, you will see that what Israel has basically done is moved in from the north and the east of the Gaza Strip and has pushed people towards the Mediterranean Sea and the Egyptian border. And so they're already going after Khan Yunis, so that will be the major city in the south, and that will push 1.5 or so million Palestinians in between either Rafah along the border with Egypt or into the safe zone along the Mediterranean Sea, which seems to be like the most hellish place on earth right now. That's where all the disease is spreading, the hunger is. North Gaza may be worse, but just the people that are lined up, and you can see them in the safe zones along the Mediterranean Sea are unbelievably horrific. And so if Rafah is taken, that's going to drive those Palestinians into the safe zone, which is already again an overcrowded famine setting in, epidemic setting in, life of absolute tent city and squalor. It will drive hundreds of thousands, if not more, Palestinians into that city or into the Sinai Peninsula. So it's pretty clear that the goal here is the genocide of the Palestinian people living in Gaza. Next up here, Israeli finance minister again calls for expulsions of Palestinians from Gaza. This from Day to Camp, antiwar.com, December 31st. Sorry. And this is the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, and he says what needs to be done in the Gaza Strip is to encourage immigration. If there are 100,000 or 200,000 Arabs in Gaza and not 2 million Arabs, the entire discussion on the day after will be totally different. They want to leave. They have been living in a ghetto for 75 years and are in need. And so, he's saying that we made their lives so the place where they live so uninhabitable. We've made their lives so hellish that all these 2 million people want to live Gaza, and so we're really doing them a favor by forcing them out, which isn't the case. You could find lots of Palestinians living in Gaza saying that they would rather die there than be forced into the Sinai Peninsula and slowly die off over the next few years. And so what Smolters says here is disgusting, but it's something that he said time and time again. And even though there are Israeli officials making these blanket statements that the policy is genocide, it does not deter the support from the White House at all. And then I wrote this one for the antiwar.com on December 29th. I thought this was pretty interesting, mainly because of how tense the conversation between Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was reported to have been. So last weekend, President Biden asked the Israeli Prime Minister to release Tel Aviv's hold on Palestinian tax money. The finance minister, Smotrich, announced Israel was rejecting the request on Friday. The White House has continued to provide Israel with unconditional support, even as Tel Aviv has snubbed several requests from the Biden administration and other senior administration officials. Barak Ravid, reporter in Axios, on Thursday that Biden and Netanyahu held what he called a difficult call. I think he also used the word frustrating in his article the previous weekend. On one point of contention was Tel Aviv withholding tax revenue collected from Palestinians, which the Israeli authorities collect on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. So Biden asked Netanyahu to accept a proposal that the Israeli Prime Minister raised himself several weeks ago to transfer the withheld tax revenues to Norway for safekeeping until an arrangement can be found that will assure Israel's concerns that the funds could not reach Hamas. A U.S. official and a source with knowledge said that Netanyahu backtracked and says he doesn't think this is a good idea anymore. He told Biden that he doesn't trust the Norwegians. Netanyahu's about-face angered Biden. So Ravid reports Biden pushed back and said the U.S. trusts Norway's proposal, and this should be enough for Israel to trust it too. Biden told Netanyahu that he should face hardliners in his coalition on this issue, like he is dealing with political pressure from Congress about the war in Gaza. After a few minutes of discussion, Biden told Netanyahu that he expects him to solve the issue, adding that this conversation is over, and he ended the call. The feeling that the president is going out on limb for Bibi every day, and when Bibi needs to give something back and take some political risk, he is unwilling to do it, one source told Axios. And so I kind of had been waiting for this moment to happen, right? Where the White House takes it a personal insult that they are doing so much for Israel, and that they're making all these requests out of Israel, and they're just absolutely refusing to meet a single one of them. And it seems like maybe this is finally leading to some frustration. So that call happened, but then on Friday, Smotrich, who denies that the Palestinians even exist, posted on X that Tel Aviv was denying Biden's request. He said, "We have a lot of respect for the USA, our best ally in the world, and for President Biden, who is a true friend of Israel. But we will never let that leave our dignity in the hands of foreigners. As long as I am the Minister of Finance, not a single shekel will go towards the Nazi terrorists in Gaza." And if he says that giving any money to the Palestinian Authority is just giving money to the Nazis in Gaza, then it sounds like he's not planning on releasing any of that money. And highly concerning, because it will probably lead to the financial collapse of the Palestinian Authority, and more suffering in the West Bank, and maybe more fighting in the West Bank as well. All right, former prime minister says Israel was behind Iranian strike on Iranian military base in 2022. So in a Wall Street Journal op-ed, former Israeli prime minister Naftali Bennett said he ordered a strike on Iran in an Iranian drone facility. The article is the first admission by Tel Aviv that it conducted a significant drone attack on Iran. Bennett argues in the op-ed that Israel needs to focus on attacking Iran. This is a quote from the article. "As prime minister, I made another decision regarding Iran. I directed Israel's security forces to make Tehran pay for its decision to sponsor terror. Enough impunity. After Iran launched 2 failed UAV attacks on Israel in February of 2022, Israel destroyed a UAV base on Iranian soil." Bennett says that Tel Aviv should adopt its policy of destroying Iran. "I've come to realize that enough is enough. The evil empire of Iran must be brought down. I told my 3 security chiefs that my goal was to avoid, if reasonably possible, local clashes with Hezbollah and Hamas, and rather to focus on Israel's national security resources on weakening our primary enemy, Iran." In the article, he also says, the U.S. should really be supporting this, because, they're the primary enemy of Iran as well, and that the U.S. needs to be the leader in the war against Iran. All right, couple here stories on Syria. Israeli strikes kill 11 senior Iranian officials at Syrian airport. Saudi media report that senior Iranian delegation was killed at the Damascus airport. Israel did not comment on the attack, and Iran denied the report. The alleged attack was the second of the week, targeting senior Iranian officials in Syria. Tehran said that Israel had committed a strategic mistake by killing a general in one of the strikes. The IRGC responded by saying that Israel would suffer for the killing. Quote, "The usurper and savage Zionist regime will pay for this crime," is the statement from the IRGC official. All right, next up here. Suspected Israeli airstrike kill at least 6 members of militant group in eastern Syria. 3 suspected Israeli airstrikes hit eastern Syria near the Iraqi border on Saturday, killing at least 6 militants. The strikes hit targets near the city of Al-Bukamal in the Deir ez-Zor province. Both the U.S. and Israel have launched strikes in the area before, but U.S. officials told the AP that the U.S. was not responsible for this round. Israel has not commented, which is in line for Israeli strikes in Syria. And Iraqi militia sources told the AP that 4 members of the Lebanese group Hezbollah were killed in the strike, as well as 2 Syrian militants. So we will see what kind of escalation this leads to. Few stories on Yemen before we wrap up here. Of course, all the Yemen stuff really has to do with Gaza too. U.S. issues sanctions on alleged network funding Houthi Red Sea attacks. The Treasury Department released a statement that said the U.S. sanctioned one individual and three entities responsible for facilitating the flow of Iranian financial assistance to the Houthi forces and their destabilizing activities. Among those designated is the head of currency exchanges in Sana'a and three exchange houses in Yemen and Turkey. I think this actually goes to show that the Biden administration really doesn't have any options for Yemen. Issuing these sanctions on an already, heavily sanctioned group, the Houthis, is probably not going to make any major difference to the Houthis. They have their ability to produce drones and have been using it quite effectively against Saudi Arabia for years as the U.S. backed the Saudis. And so, issuing sanctions, I think from the U.S. is just, oh, look, we're doing something. Well, it may hurt the people of Yemen, but it probably won't actually do anything about the Houthis. All right, this one from Date to Camp, December 28th, 2023. U.S. allies reluctant to join anti-Houthi Red Sea Naval Coalition. While the U.S. is trying to put on a united front to prevent Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, many U.S. allies are reluctant to participate in the task force that has been formed, formerly known as Operation Prosperity Guardian, Reuters reported on Thursday. The Pentagon claims 20 countries are participating in the operation, but the U.S. has only announced 12. We will allow other countries, defer to them to talk about their participation, the Pentagon said last week. And it's usually not a great sign for your military operation if the countries involved won't even announce their operation. Even if some of the countries the U.S. said were members of the coalition have issued statements distancing themselves from it after the U.S. announced Operation Prosperity Guardian and said Spain was a participant. Madrid denied its involvement. The Spanish Defense Ministry said we will not participate unilaterally in the Red Sea operation. Italy, which was also included in the U.S. announcement, said it would send a frigate to prevent Italian shipping interests, but made clear that the deployment was not a part of the U.S.-led operation. Notably absent from the coalition is Saudi Arabia, the U.S.'s main partner in the region. And as I explained on the last show, I can't imagine that there is any scenario where the Saudis are going to go to war with the Houthis now, just because I think it would be seen and viewed as a war against the Houthis for sticking up for the Palestinians on behalf of the Israelis. Even in a kingdom, the politics might not play out too well for Mohammed bin Salman if he were to go down that route. All right, so the U.S. says it shot down 12 Houthi drones, 5 missiles in the Red Sea. This happened last week, December 26th, and we've had more of these events since. This one was from, I want to say, on December 28th, and this is a CENTCOM statement. The USS Mason shot down 1 drone and 1 anti-ship ballistic missile in the southern Red Sea that were fired by the Houthis on December 28. There was no damage to any of the 18 warships in the area or report injuries. This is the 22nd attempted attack by the Houthis on international shipping since October 19th. And one thing I want to mention here is I have a listener of the show who sometimes helps me understand weapons, particularly missiles. And we had a conversation about the anti-ship ballistic missiles. And, these aren't widely used around the world. Most anti-ship missiles are cruise missiles, or I guess maybe some form of rocket or something like that. But ballistic missiles travel at a high rate of speed. And I do wonder that, there's probably going to be a severe accuracy issues from the Houthi. Apparently the Chinese also do have anti-ship ballistic missiles, but my guess is that the Houthis do not have the same satellite capabilities and GPS targeting capabilities that the Chinese have. And so I would assume that these ballistic missiles are probably fairly inaccurate. The problem that they may present for U.S. Central Command, of course, is that ballistic missiles tend to travel at a high rate of speed, and you do wonder if the U.S. ships are prepared to deal with a threat from ballistic missiles, and of course it could cause a lot of damage if it did end up hitting a U.S. ship. All right, so the UK and US are preparing to attack Yemen. The Sunday Times reports, and I'm quoting from the article here, Britain's military is preparing to launch a wave of airstrikes against the Iranian-backed Houthis, creating chaos in the Red Sea, raising the prospects of a significant spiral in tensions in the region. Under the plans, the UK would join with the US and possibly another European country to unleash a salvo of missiles against pre-planned targets, either in the sea or in Yemen itself, where the militants are based. It is understood an unprecedented statement is expected to be released by the UK and the US in the coming hours, which will warn the Houthis to stop attacks on commercial vessels or face the military might of the West. The Whitehall source said the statement was the last warning, and if the Houthis failed to stop the attacks, the response would likely be limited but significant. It is believed that the Allies are currently trying to persuade other European countries to work with the US and UK to stop the attacks amid fears there could be a disastrous economic implications if shipping transitioning through one of the world's most important maritime trade routes continue to be disrupted. So, interesting things here is what's the third European country they're trying to get in with them here. And then as I brought up before, if they're already picking sides and they have uh targets selected, a lot of the Houthis capabilities here are very, very mobile. And as we've seen in what the US has done, say, in response to the attacks in Iraq and Syria, they really haven't prevented future attacks. And in fact, when the US attacks, there's usually a significant response from these groups, and US troops get attacked more. All right, last story here. Hope everybody has a good New Year's and, starts the year off right. Sorry, I didn't have any good news to really mention on today's show. U.S. military sinks 3 Houthi boats in Red Sea, killing 10. The U.S. military sank 3 vessels belonging to Yemen's Houthis during a confrontation in the Red Sea on Sunday, killing 10 as tensions continue to rise in the region due to the U.S.-backed Israeli slaughter in Gaza, according to Central Command. 4 Houthi boats were attacking and attempting to seize a container ship which was struck by a missile a day earlier. CENTCOM sent helicopters from aircraft carriers. The Dwight D. Eisenhower responded to the distress call and then engaged with the Houthi boats. In response, in the processing of the issuing of verbal calls to the small boats fired on U.S. helicopters with crews served weapons as small arms. The U.S. Navy helicopters returned fire in self-defense, sinking 3 vessels and 4 small boats and killing the crews. The Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, confirmed the incident and said that at least 10 of their Navy personnel were killed. The Houthis have been launching attacks on the Israeli-linked shipping in protest of the assault on Gaza and have vowed they won't back down in the face of the U.S. Navy. The Houthis said the boats the U.S. attacked were performing humanitarian and moral duty to prevent Israeli ships or those heading to or ports of the occupied territories of Palestine from passing through the Red Sea. Houthi military spokesperson said the U.S. bears the consequences and repercussions of this crime and said that the U.S. military maneuvers in the Red Sea to prevent Israel vessels will not deter Yemen from fulfilling its religious, moral, and humanitarian duty to support and champion the oppression of Palestine and Gaza. So, this seems to be, another major escalation there. My hope is, again, and I explained this and went into quite a bit of detail on the last show, and even I talked about part of the problem with Dave Smith. So again, if you haven't already listened to that, I head over and listen to it now. Again, if you guys could let Dave know that you liked myself and Connor on the show and that you'd like to hear from us more, we would both really appreciate it. We, really look forward to getting back on Dave's show at some point in the new year. So anyways, I don't think the U.S. has very many options for dealing with the Houthis, at least militarily. And so hopefully we don't see a larger escalation come from this, but it's a real possibility, a real threat. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in on today's show. I will be back with more later in the week.